So thank you everyone for signing in today, joining us for a few minutes of your time. I appreciate your interest in counterfeit prescription drugs, which is often tied with novel psychoactive substances. So we will get started. If you're not familiar, Aegis has been providing laboratory services for over 30 years for various companies and organizations throughout the United States. Have a broad range of testing services that we offer. Pain Comp and Accurize ID are kind of the core toxicology business. Interact RX is a drug-drug interaction test. CardioSure is a cardiac compliance test. And Biodetect is our new enhanced specimen validity test that we offer. So for today, we're going to discuss counterfeit drugs and their composition, which is variable. We're going to discuss the risks associated with ingestion of these drugs and show some examples, pictures of these drugs that we have seen in the literature. And we will talk about a few reports which contain novel psychoactive substances which are known to be present in certain counterfeit drugs. So we'll start by describing them. What are they? They are typically formulated to look like a prescription drug. But they are trying to deceive someone ultimately. So they're either trying to deceive the end user and pass something off as a prescription drug that isn't, or they're intended to deceive law enforcement or other regulatory agencies to make it look like a common prescription drug and not a traditional illicit drug. They pose an unknown risk to the end user because not only does the ultimate user, the person who uses the drug, may not know the actual content of that drug, the seller themselves may or may not know the actual contents of the drug. They may be thinking they're selling you oxycodone or apprazolam, and they're really not. Most are formulated to look like controlled substances, so not just prescription drugs, but they're made to look like common controlled substances. Opioids were the first ones that we typically were encountering, but benzodiazepines have emerged over the last several years, along with stimulants being described really for the first time over the last couple of years. Prescription stimulant uh, counterfeit mimics. In some of these cases, they contain illicit drugs and or novel psychoactive substances or both. And then traditionally, they do not contain the drug that they're intended to mimic. So if it's a counterfeit alprazolam, it typically does not contain alprazolam. It contains something else. As I mentioned, they're unpredictable in their makeup. They can contain one or many different compounds. There's no regulations that apply to the manufacturing these products because they're not FDA approved sites. In many cases, they're shacks or shanties out in the middle of a field or in the woods. There's really no quality assurance with the production of these products, and they carry a high likelihood of being contaminated with drugs, other drugs that just happen to be in the vicinity while these are being made. So we mentioned patients are usually unaware of what they're really ingesting. There can be illicit drugs. There can be novel psychoactive substances, and then traditional other illegal drugs as well. The role that these counterfeit drugs play in overdoses is not largely understood because, in many cases, they contain novel psychoactive substances, which, depending upon the testing performed as part of the medical examination, they may or may not test for these novel psychoactive substances. They, in many cases, you will see these referred to as fentanyl deaths, illicitly manufactured fentanyl, to be more precise, not to be confused with the pharmaceutical fentanyl. But they may contain things other than just that illicitly manufactured fentanyl. They may contain fentanyl analogs or other drugs as well, which were not tested for. So, how do people obtain these? Traditionally, these are clandestine labs or unregulated chemists were the initial sources of these drugs. You would order them over the internet and get them delivered to your house via an air freight carrier, shipping container. However, more criminal organizations have enveloped these into their portfolio of products that they distribute. And so now you see some traditional drug smuggling routes come into play as a major source for some of these products. This is one example of that. This is an article from Parents Magazine, founded in Yahoo Life from November 2019. The benzodiazepines becoming more popular amongst teens. And one quote in here mentions designer benzodiazepines. So these are the novel psychoactive benzodiazepines. These are not your traditional prescription benzodiazepines. You can buy these on traditional mainstream social media sites. We won't mention them by name, but very, very common social media platforms used by both youth and adults. You can buy these drugs on those platforms. And these are, again, are in many cases designer benzodiazepines. They think they're buying an alprazolam and they're not. So let's talk about a few examples. We'll start with the counterfeit benzodiazepines, which was sort of like the story I just mentioned. The photo on the right, and I'll mention that all of the photos that I'm using are unclassified photos. None of this is classified. There certainly are classified photos that you can find if you have law enforcement resources. If you're interested, they may be able to share more with you. But all of my photos come from sources which are freely available to anyone. So this photo is a counterfeit alprazolam, which actually contains flu alprazolam, which is one of the more common designer benzodiazepines that we see. The text on the left is from a study done in Australia. They looked at 46 benzodiazepine tablets, which are counterfeits. They looked for only three designer benzodiazepines. So these were the ones that they see the most common there. And they found in these tablets variable amounts of drug. So in some, they contained up to 8.3 milligrams of etizolam, 2 milligrams of flualprazolam, zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2 of flubromazolam. And they found that several of the tablets had more than one of these benzodiazepines present. So very unpredictable in what they have. Even if you think you're buying an etizolam as a mimic, you don't know what you're getting. And this study was published last year, so a fairly fresh study. The DEA has just launched a website over the last few months called One Pill Can Kill, and this is some resources and pictures of counterfeit drugs that they have seen. I've pulled a few of those and put in here. This is an example of a counterfeit generic alprazolam. And so there's not just uh, one formulation of alprazolam that's mimicked. In addition to the brand name, there are mimics of the generic as well. And this is one example of those that from the DEA. This study was in JAMA Internal Medicine a little over 5 years ago, a little bit dated, but another photo of a counterfeit branded alprazolam tablet. This one contained just a small amount of etizolam, 10.6 micrograms of etizolam. But the scary part was this one contained 3.4 milligrams of fentanyl. If you're very familiar with the fentanyl dosing, 3.4 milligrams is a massive amount of fentanyl. This is a article from Pediatrics, a small case series that from Oregon, where they identified 6 adolescents who thought they were getting alprazolam, and they actually got flu alprazolam in their counterfeit product. All 6 required admission to the emergency room. All 6 did recover, thankfully, but they did spend some time in the emergency room being stabilized. So again, these are available to um, teenagers, young adults very freely. This article from U.S. News World Report within the last 6 months. Um, Very telling article. You skip down to the bottom. Overdoses involving or where a prescription benzodiazepine were involved, not necessarily the cause of death, but where they were involved, that overdose rose 22% from 2019 to 2020. However, you go back to the first sentence, designer benzodiazepines, where they were involved in overdoses, it rose 520%. So a vast increase in the availability of these designer benzodiazepines from over the last couple of years. And again, these are things that are not picked up by traditional drug testing. So your traditional drug testing for benzodiazepines, the overdoses from those rose 22%, but these designer benzodiazepines, which people tend to not test for, rose 520%, a massive increase, stating, kind of illustrating that, while you would like to have testing for these designer benzodiazepines at your disposal. This is an example of a report, actual report, de-identified, that kind of illustrates this testing. There are 3 designer benzodiazepines in this sample: bromazolam, and then etizolam and flubromazolam. Metabolites of those last 2 were present. You look just below that, the traditional benzodiazepine tested was ordered as well. So your traditional diazepines, there are none present. So if you order traditional testing, this is a pretty clean sample. But if you order designer benzodiazepines, you see that they have 3 of those present. So very different story depending solely upon what testing you order. Over the last 6 or 7 months, we've detected 8 different designer benzodiazepines in our samples, and we detect roughly 250 a month. So about 225 to 275 or so is the range there. So these are things that are definitely in circulation in our patient samples, and this is an underrepresentation of what is there because this is only when this test was ordered by a provider. This is no indication of how often it's actually present in our samples, probably much higher than what it is. This is just when a provider's decided to order testing. So underrepresented as far as how prevalent they are. I believe this is a newer phenomenon to watch, and that's counterfeit amphetamine tablets. So this again from the DEA. The bottom panel is a counterfeit. The top is the legit. Um, this is methamphetamine instead of Adderall. So if you have someone who believes they're taking an Adderall from a friend or family member, um, and they did not get it at a pharmacy themselves, they could be ingesting methamphetamine instead of their Adderall. So it's very dangerous. Again, from the One Pill Can Kill website, these are pictures of other generics of Adderall that they have seen. Again, containing methamphetamine. So the opioids were some of the first ones that we would see and started to see reports of. Oxycodone. This is a mimic of oxycodone 30 milligram on the left, which contains fentanyl, and the right side is luggage full of these little pills. So each one of those bags, guesstimating somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pills, and multiple bags in there. There very likely could be 100,000, 10,000, 50,000 pills in there. Who really knows? But there's a lot of them there. But it's all fentanyl. It's not oxycodone. This was from several years ago in the Washington Post. The story was in the Washington Post, but it actually was. The photograph is from locally here in Tennessee. This is a generic oxycodone product, very familiar to you, but it did contain fentanyl. This is a example of a designer opioid report. This is one where carfentanil was present. We have found carfentanil in some of our samples. In addition, at the very bottom there, there's fentanyl and norfentanyl, which is again likely from the illicitly manufactured fentanyl and not from the prescription product. There's cocaine and some morphine present as well, so it could be an indicator of potential heroin use mixed with these fentanyl products. This is a story from the Wall Street Journal, again, about 5 years ago, where they had found some counterfeit hydrocodone. So it's not just oxycodone products. Hydrocodone products are counterfeited as well. And this product contained fentanyl, promethazine, cocaine, and a little bit of acetaminophen as well. So again, someone thinking they're getting hydrocodone, they're getting cocaine and fentanyl along with some promethazine to boot. This is a report where we had both a designer opioid and a designer benzodiazepine present. At the top, 8-aminoclonazepam is a metabolite of clonazepam, one of the more common designer benzodiazepines that we see. And they had two designer opioids present, so benzylfentanyl and fluorofentanyl. Fluorofentanyl is right now one of the hottest fentanyl analogs that's left in circulation. They're beginning to be replaced by other classes of drugs. They're known as nitazene opioids because there has been some increased legislation targeting fentanyl, trying to get a better handle on regulating it. The clandestine labs and cartels have started to switch to other classes of drugs which are not covered by all this new legislation. That's something to watch for in the future. We do have some of those nitazene class opioids in our test, and we are detecting those on an increasing basis. So we'll reiterate the counterfeit drugs. The risks, of course, dependence is a risk. Toxicity from either the drug itself or from cutting agents. You can see sometimes really harmful cutting agents are added to these drugs and can have just as bad, if not worse, effects than the actual drug itself, which is difficult to imagine, but it does happen. Then, of course, overdose, we've talked about a little bit. There definitely is potential for overdose deaths with the use of these products. If you do many local searches of overdose death from drugs, a lot of times counterfeit drugs are involved. Many times these are fairly high profile cases. There's been several over the last few years where counterfeit drugs have been involved. I typically don't include those in this type of presentation, but they're certainly there if you want to search for those on your own. It's very sad that there's both high profile cases and random everyday individuals who are overdosing from the use of these products. So the key takeaways to consider, I would always advise stressing with patients, only take medications that you get from a licensed pharmacy. And typically that's going to be a brick and mortar pharmacy, although there are more mail order options for pharmacies these days. You just want to make sure that they're getting that from a reputable and licensed pharmacy. Once you get those in your hands, you want to store them securely to discourage any kind of swapping or theft of those products, because sometimes you could swap these out with a look-alike and you would never know it. And again, stressing that access to these counterfeit drugs is not difficult. It's much easier now to get drugs than searching out a street dealer to on a corner, as traditionally individuals had to do. You can get these on social media very easily without leaving your home. So, if there are any questions, feel free to contact us. That's our email address for our clinical team, clinical at aegislabs.com, or contact your regional sales manager and they'll be happy to assist you. Thank you for your time today. Hope you've enjoyed this presentation. It's been helpful. And again, let us know if you have any questions. Have a great day.